Did you know that the way most churches celebrate the Lord's Supper today might be completely different from how the earliest Christians did it? What if I told you that the original intent of the Eucharist was a communal meal, not a sacred ritual? You're about to discover how a simple gathering around a meal transformed into a highly ritualized practice that we see today. Stick around to the end to find out why this matters and how it impacts your faith. The Apostle Paul's description of the Lord's Supper in 1 Corinthians 11 verses 17 to 34 shows a strikingly different picture compared to modern practices. In Corinth, the Lord's Supper was a communal meal where believers ate together, but Paul had to address major issues. Some members were eating all the food and getting drunk while others went hungry. Paul condemns this selfish behavior, emphasizing that the purpose of the meal is to remember Christ's sacrifice together, as a community. He highlights the need to discern the body. Not just the physical body of Christ but the collective body of believers, the Church. Failing to recognize this communal aspect was the core of the problem. This is clear when he says, "Anyone who eats and drinks without discerning the body eats and drinks judgment on himself," 1 Corinthians 11 verse 29. In other words, the problem was not that they misunderstood the elements but that they ignored the needs of fellow believers. Paul's solution to the problem is simple and clear. "So then, my brothers and sisters, when you gather to eat, you should all eat together," 1 Corinthians 11 verse 33. The summary of Paul's instruction is that the community must wait for one another, emphasizing unity and consideration. However, as the church grew and developed, the practice began to shift. Let's look at how this happened through the writings of the early church fathers. The Didache, c. 70 to 110 AD, gives one of the earliest descriptions of Christian worship. It refers to a thanksgiving meal where bread and wine are shared, with prayers of gratitude to God. There is no mention of the bread and wine being the actual body and blood of Christ, nor is there a sense of a priestly figure administering the elements. You can find the Didache in collections of early Christian writings, such as the Apostolic Fathers translated by Bruce M. Metzger. Clement of Rome, c. 96 AD, does not specifically describe the Eucharist, but he draws a parallel between the sacrificial system of the Old Testament and new Christian practices in his letter A 1 Clement. You can read this text in the Apostolic Fathers or online at early Christian writings. Ignatius of Antioch, c. 110 AD, is one of the first to emphasize the Eucharist as a means of unity, under the authority of a bishop. In his letter to the Smyrnians, he writes that only those services overseen by the bishop are valid. You can find this in the Epistles of Ignatius available through early Christian writings. Justin Martyr, c. 155 AD, gives a more formal description of the Eucharist in his First Apology, explaining that it is bread and wine mixed with water that becomes the body and blood of Christ. You can read his works in the Ante-Nicene Fathers series or online at New Advent. Clement of Alexandria, c. 150 to 215 AD, introduces the idea that the wine and bread are symbols in the Instructor, Book 2. He even likens the wine to milk, emphasizing spiritual nourishment. You can read his works in the Ante-Nicene Fathers series or online at Christian Classics Ethereal Library, CCEL. Tom Wadsworth, in his lecture series on early Christian practices, points out that the shift from communal meal to ritualized Eucharist was influenced by the development of church hierarchy and the increasing emphasis on sacramental theology. You can find his lectures on YouTube, check the link in the description. Finally, Tertullian, c. 155 to 240 AD, begins to defend the Eucharist against heresies on the resurrection of the flesh. He treats the bread and wine as sacred elements but also leans towards a symbolic interpretation. You can find Tertullian's works in the Ante-Nicene Fathers series or on New Advent. By the time of Tertullian, the Eucharist had evolved from a communal meal into a ritual with significant liturgical meaning, administered by ordained leaders. This shift from communal to ceremonial marks a major transformation in how the practice was perceived. Conclusion: what happened between Paul's vision of a community meal and the structured, almost priestly ritual that developed later? The evolution was shaped by theological debates, the influence of Old Testament sacrificial imagery, and the growth of church hierarchy. Tom Wadsworth's research highlights how this transformation impacted the early church's understanding of fellowship and community. Suggestions for implementation. For churches and home groups that want to more closely resemble Paul's description of the Lord's Supper, consider the following. First, make the meal itself a central part of the gathering rather than just a symbolic act. Encourage every participant to bring food to share as an expression of unity. Second, use the meal as an opportunity for dialogue, allow people to share insights, ask questions, and even debate respectfully. This will foster a more engaging and community-driven experience rather than a passive ritual. Third, emphasize that the purpose of the meal is not just individual reflection but mutual edification, as stated in 1 Corinthians 14 verse 26, let all things be done for edification. Prioritize building each other up through encouragement, prayer, and discussion during the gathering. But how did this communal meal turn into a highly structured ritual? And why did the role of the pastor evolve into something more akin to a high priest? We'll uncover that in the next episode. Don't miss it, subscribe so you're notified when it drops.